the first thing that comes to my mind when I heard about the Muslim sport is that the woman will they have to cover their head with the strap, and they cannot eat pork. So yes, they are the first thing that comes to my mind.
他们不太能吃猪肉，然后就是因为现在阿富汗的事情也蛮严重的，所以就会有些刻板印象会觉得说他可能还比较激进一点。
我觉得穆斯林是一个比较特别的宗教，就是因为就是一天他们有5个不同时间一定要拜拜的，对。然后还有比较特别的，就在每一年大概1个月，他们要在一起，就是他们大概晚上7点才可以吃东西，还有早上3、4点才可以吃东西。然后他们还有很多方法，就是像他们不可以吃猪，还有很多方法，所以我觉得是比较特别。我也觉得比较有点麻烦，也是比较真的很 unique 的一个宗教。对。
我现在关注的主题是，我听到这个词，我会想到的是现在在讨论的可能世俗国家和宗教国家之间的适应问题，比如说在所谓的世俗国家，比如说欧洲、法国，他们的穆斯林社群越来越庞大的状况下，当地的法国人和当地的穆斯林怎么去，可能我看到新闻上常常说，可能会有一些冲突或矛盾，然后包括说几年前有一些比较大的新闻，像《查理日报》或者是法国老师被杀害，都跟两边之间的我想文化冲突有关吧，这样。
其实我自己本身比较有关注的是中国的维吾尔少数民族这样子。那为什么会去关注？其实因为我蛮好奇，就是中国那边的关系这样子。那我知道的是，他有一点迫害维吾尔的那一个嫌疑，但是其实他们当局不承认啊。那我很愿意相信国际社会就是他们的观点这样子。我是觉得可以再深入的去调查。那我是对，就是这样吧。
主要前阵子就是最近就是塔利班嘛，那前阵子是那个在新疆，
对，
然后中国政府对维吾尔族想要进行汉化，然后对他们的传统，那在更可能几十年，那中东那里因为以色列复国嘛，那他们就夺走原本在那里巴勒斯坦人的领地，那在那里就是周围的伊斯兰国家、中东国家对以色列的仇视，然后产生的那些冲突。
如果是说关于我有没有就是对穆斯林还有伊斯兰教有了解的话，我自己是比较少接触到这边的新闻的。那可能比较常看到就是报纸上会写说，就是有些 不知道那是个人行为吧，就是伊斯兰的那个恐怖分子，然后会发动一些比较对社会比较震惊的一些事件，这样子。那我基本上接触到的资讯都是这些。
Long story actually. Well, when I was like in grade 9, there was the Boston explosion, a terrorist attack, and when I didn't know much about Islam before, but I was a fangirl of Zayn Malik. You know him? One Direction, Zayn Malik, and I saw him got a lot of hate on Twitter, and I was like, that was so strange to me that I don't know what he has to do with the marathon explosion, and that was the first time I get to know what's the word? Islamophobia.
About the current issue, I think I'm going to come up with this is not the current news, but later it happened in like last year when we know that the tragedy happened in France when someone tried to paint or draw our big and great Prophet Muhammad SAW, peace be upon him, because in Islam perspective or Islamic law, we are not allowed, everyone of Muslim, we are not allowed to draw or paint any kind of pictures of our own Prophet, because no one can resemble him. And then there's this case happened in France when someone tried to draw him in a picture, tried to paint him in a picture and resemble him like a human being. We know that our Prophet Muhammad is also a human being, but no one can picture him, and no one are allowed according to Islamic perspective and Islamic law. And then no one has done it ever since. But because of this French law, they are argue that they have this kind of like freedom. But again, their freedoms against the border of Islamic perspective of Islamic law. And this is what happened when this tragedy happened. One of Muslim in France, they kill the suspected of people who draw, of the person who draw the caricature or the paint of our prophet. And then we definitely condemn this kind of like action of the murdering. But again, we also condemn the person who tried to pictures of our great Prophet Muhammad SAW.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to join us for our last day, the third day of our Muslim Film Festival. If you watched the film that we screened this morning, Tears of Gaza and Ghost Hunting, you must be here with very heavy heart. If you've been through with this movies in the first day, second day, and the keynote speech lectures from Friday to Saturday, I believe you also experience similar feelings of some hopes, some despair, some frustration, some wonder what we should do or what is to come for the future. From Southeast Asia to Uyghur or in Xinjiang to Middle East, Syria or Iraq, Iran. And last night or yesterday evening, we listened to the very tragic long history of Afghanistan. And this morning, we see these two films concerning the children and the people in Palestine. This political persecution, oppression, exclusion, and women's the honor killing, and now this is this war, unending war. There seems that there's no way to reason or press charges against these crimes. So we need to also understand Palestine. We know in Chinese, 八节, Palestinian liberation. It is really our honor to have Dr. Bao to talk to us about the idea of liberation, beginning and method. Dr. Bao received his in Palestinian studies and focusing on Hamas political transformation and engagement, the 2003 to 2013. His dissertation was supervised by the activist and historian Ilan Pappy. Maybe Dr. Bao would mention that later on. And Dr. Bao, he has published quite frequently in local newspapers in Taiwan to introduce and to explain the Palestinian situation, both in the Reporter, very important independent news media, and Storm Media. So Dr. Bao will give you the floor, and please, you may start. Thank you for coming. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for Professor Liu's introduction. I'm so pleased to attend this Muslim Film Festival. And the lecture in this afternoon I would like to address is entitled The Idea of Liberation, Beginning and the Methods. I would like to elaborate how the idea of liberation came out for many Palestinians and how Palestinians unionized the idea of liberation over the 70 years, as the liberation can be seen as the fundamental means for the Palestinian struggles after the creation of Israel in 1948. Maybe you have heard a slogan, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." And this slogan is usually chanted by activists on the street when Palestinians were under Israeli bombardment. And this slogan literally means Palestinians will liberate all Palestinian homeland from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River after they lost in 1948. But the idea of liberation is not simply liberate all Palestinian homeland. It also includes the right of return of Palestinian refugees and the removal of all obstacles under the Israeli occupations, such as the removal of Israeli settlements, the release of Palestinian political prisoners. The Palestinians also have the right to reach the dignity, freedom, and the economic security as many people have in other countries. And this lecture is to reveal the idea of liberation from a historical perspective. The relevance of this lecture include my past interview with Palestinians and the article and the academic books written by Palestinian activists and scholars. And the lecture will be divided into 3 sections. Firstly, I would like to talk about the historical background of the idea of liberation, which is the most important part of this lecture. Today, news media often cover the story of Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but it seldom tells the root cause of this conflict. For Palestinians, it is not a simply conflict, but a way of liberation. So the first section will introduce the beginning of the idea of liberation. What was the historical background of the idea of liberation, and why Palestinians firmly believe like the idea of liberation is the only way to end the Israeli occupation. Secondly, I will analyze the early methods of liberation, why Palestinian national movement like PLO and Hamas adopted the armed struggle as the main strategies for liberation, and why these strategies could not help Palestinians to end the Israeli occupation. The third section will talk about a new methods of liberation. A new method of liberation has been emerged more than 15 years. In particular, the BDS movement and the idea of one-state solution may provide the possibility for liberation. Later, I will explain what is the BDS movement and the idea of one-state solution. Before going to the first section, a definition of Palestinian and the Zionist is needed to be given. Palestinian is a national identity around the early 20th centuries onward. Ethnicity, Palestinian is Arabs, speaking Arabic, and most of them are Muslim. Some of them are Christian. No matter Palestinians live in Islam or in Christianity, they have collective memory of 1948, when Israel declared independence. Around 80% of Palestinians were forced to leave their homeland and become refugees. As for those Palestinians who remain within the territory of Israel, they were under Israeli military control until 1967. After 1948, young Palestinians start a national movement, and their aim is to liberate all Palestinians, all Palestine, from the river to the sea. And this movement is a continued project. Zionism is another national identity from the late 19th century. Zionists are Jews. However, not every Jew is a Zionist. Zionists believe the right of return to the land of Israel, and they were determined to create a Jewish sovereignty in this land. But the land of Israel is not accepted by Palestinians because it covers areas like Palestinians live. But through Zionist leaders' efforts and with the help by the British authority in the early 20th century, Zionists finally created the State of Israel in 1948. If we understand the definition of Palestinian and the Zionists, let's move on to the first section, the idea of liberation from a historical background. Today, Palestinian perception of liberation of Palestine include Israeli territories and also the occupied territory, such as the East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. As you can see the map from the right-hand side. But from the late 19th century to the end of the First World War, there was no geographical term named Palestine. Instead, this area was controlled under the Ottoman authority. If we look at the map on the right-hand side, this area was divided into 3 administration units. The central part and the north part and the central part was the province of the Beirut. And the south part belonged to the province of Syria. After the First World War, the British Army occupied the 3 parts and integrate them into one administration unit, which is the foundation of the modern Palestine. If we look at the social structure of Palestine in the late 19th century, before the arrival of the European Zionist immigrants, of million people live in this land. They were Arabic speaking, and most of them were Sunni Muslims, accounting for 72% of the total population, and some of them are Christian and the Jews, accounting for 12% and 4% of the total population. Meanwhile, around 10% were Ottoman soldiers and officers. Another 2% were European merchants, diplomats, and missionaries. If we look at where Palestinians live, around 80% of Palestinians live in small villages. As you can see, this origin point across this map. And 20% of Palestinians live in urban cities, such as Jerusalem, Nablus, Arkai, and Hebron. And these urban cities cultivate the early identity of Palestinians. The elite children receive modern education, including the idea of nationalism. And these students later become the first generation of Palestinian national movement. The period of the British Mandate of Palestine was crucial for the formation of collective identity of Palestinians. After the First World War, the British governed Palestine according to the Mandate system. So what is the Mandate system? The Mandate system was decided by the League of Nations. The League of Nations can be seen as the predecessor of the United Nations. And the Mandate system aimed to help Arabs to build a new nation after the First World War. But the League of Nations did not consider Arabs were able to build a new nation. Therefore, Britain was assigned to help Arabs to complete this mission. The British mandate include Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine. Among these three nations, Palestine could be seen as the more difficult one for the British governance. When Britain governed Palestine in the early 1920s, actually many Palestinians welcomed Britain because they suffered a lot during the First World War, and they wanted their life to go back to normal. However, the British authority did not have a good intention to help Palestinians to build a new nation. Instead, the British authority adopted the policy of dividing. For example, the law of British mandate encouraged Jews from Europe immigrate to Palestine and to build a national home. Jews were allowed to establish political agency in charge of political and diplomatic rights, while Palestinians did not have the same equal right. With the British political commitment to the Zionist leader, large number of Jews, mainly from Europe, immigrated in the 1920s and the 1930s. The Jewish immigration to Palestine could be back to the late 19th century. Jews suffered from racism across Europe at that time. In order to end this racism, Zionist leaders planned to move out from Europe, and Palestine was the final destination for many of them. During the British mandate, Jewish population dramatically increased in Palestine. In particular, the number of Jewish immigration increased by 4 times from 1931 to 1935, as you can see from this diagram. As for Palestinians, they appealed to the British government to stop the Jewish immigration, but their requests were rejected. As a result, Palestinians turned to their anger to the British authority. In April 1936, Palestinians started to organize the general strike against the British mandate. The general strike aimed to force the British authority to change policy on the Jewish immigration, but the general strike turned into military confrontation between and the British Authority, and between Palestinian and the Jewish communities. The Palestinian revolt was a major blow to the British mandate, as many Palestinians did not believe that the British Authority will help them to build a new nation. The Palestinian revolt lasted for 3 years. The British government used heavy weapons to put down the revolt. According to statistics, more than 5,000 Palestinians were killed, and more than 14,000 Palestinians were injured. In addition, Palestinian leadership was carried out. Many Palestinian leaders were exiled or arrested by the British Authority. Later, Palestinian historians indicate that this rebellion made Palestinians vulnerable to the later Israeli independence in 1948. But the Palestinian rebellion really forced the British Authority to change policy. After the rebellion, the British Authority restricted the number of Jewish immigration to Palestine. But for some Zionists, the limitation of Jewish immigration violated the British commitment to Zionists. They feel betrayed and started to against the British government. After the Second World War, Zionist militia launched hundreds of military attacks on British. The British government was unable to deal with Zionist rebellion. In February 1947, the British government declared its intention to end the mandate of Palestine and decided to hand over this problem to the United Nations. On 29 November 1947, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution known as 1A1 resolution. This resolution suggested Palestine will be divided into 2 states, the Arab state and the Jewish state. As you can see from the map on the left-hand side, the future Arab state, or we can say the state of Palestine, is located in the brown zone. And the future state, the future Jewish state, covers the blue zone. And the city of Jerusalem will be governed by the international regime. In fact, this partition plan did not reflect the reality. As you can see from another map on the right-hand side, the map indicates the land ownership 48. Most Jews settlers live in the purple section, and most of them live in the coastline. As for many Palestinians, they live in the green section, covering the most part of Palestine. The United Nations expected the partition plan will resolve the question of Palestine. However, after the UN resolution passed, the tension between Jewish settlers and the Palestinians was severe. In 1947, Jews were minority in Palestine. The Jewish population were around 600,000, while the Palestinian population were around 1,200,000. It seemed Jews were not able to fight with Palestinians in terms of numbers, but the Zionist leaders were prepared well for the expected war. On 15 May 1948, Zionist leaders declared independence of the state of Israel. Arab countries such as Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq declared war on Israel on the same day. This is known as the First Arab-Israeli War. And this war lasts for nearly a year, and with 2-time ceasefire under the UN mediation. After the war, Israel controlled 78% of Palestine. The left-hand side of the map is the original partition plan, according to the UN Resolution 181. After the war, Israel seized extra 22% of the territory, the purple section, as you can see from the map on the right-hand side of the slide. As for the rest of the territories, the Gaza was under the Egyptian military control, and the East Jerusalem and the West Bank was under the Jordanian administration. So the state of Palestine did not exist after the war. For Palestinians, the war created the question of the Palestinian refugees. From 1948 to 1949, nearly 80% of Palestinians were forced to leave their homeland, and they scattered to nearby Arab countries, mainly in Jordan, in Lebanon, and Syria. For Palestinians, the 1948 war is not simply a war. Instead, it has a significance. The 1948 war is also known as Nakba. Nakba is Arabic, literally means catastrophe. To put it simply, the 1948 war for Zionists is an independent war, but the new country like the built was under destruction of Palestinian society. In other words, Nakba represents the complete collapse of the Palestinian society, politics, and the economics. An Israeli historian, Ilan Pappé, applied the term, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, to the 1948 war. After his analyzing the classified Israeli military archive, Pappé reconstructed the history of the 1948 war. He indicated that when the British government declared an intention of withdrawal from Palestine in February 1947, Zionist leaders started to decide a plan of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. In fact, from the late 1930s, Zionist leader has a basic plan for the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, but they call it an idea of transfer. The transfer means the removal of the majority of Palestinians, as many as possible, in order to keep the domination of the Jewish community. From the late 1930s, Zionist intelligence has surveyed Palestinian villages and the cities. This survey includes location of each village, its access roads, the quality of land, economy, agriculture, and the social condition. One of particular survey is like Zionist intelligence identified the hostility of Palestinians toward Jews. Any Palestinian who ever fought with Zionist settler and the British authority were all recruited by Zionist intelligence. And this survey was completed in the late 1940s and became Plan D. Zionist munition followed this Plan D for the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1948. When the war ended in the late 1949, Zionist munition uprooted total 531 Palestinian villages. As you can see, the black point across the purple section, and also another 11 cities were empty. As a result, more than half of Palestinians became refugees, and they were denied to go back to their homeland. After 1949, Nakba constitutes the main element of Palestinian identity. Palestinians commemorate Nakba. The feeling of deportation, oppression, and the sadness can come out. But Nakba is not always negative. Many Palestinians, stimulated by Nakba, engage in the national liberation movement and fight for their rights like they lost in 1948. So it can be said like Nakba has become a collective memory of Palestinians today. Even young Palestinians did not really experience Nakba in 1948. They still listen to stories from their grandparents or their parents. And they also witnessed the daily injustice under the Israeli occupation. For them, Nakba is not only a history, but is an ongoing reality. After 1948, many young Palestinians who experienced Nakba were committed to the idea of liberation. The way to implement the idea of liberation is through the armed struggle. In the 1950s, young Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank launched a guerrilla war to Jewish settlers, and they were called Fida'in, the freedom fighters. But the guerrilla war was not effective. Israeli army fought back with strong forces, resulting in the death of the thousands of Palestinians. From the 1950s to 1960, Palestinian national movement was a new trend. Many organizations were formed by young Palestinians, and the most representative one was Fatah. Fatah is the reverse acronym of the Palestinian National Liberation Movement and the elite Palestinians to fight for liberation over the 30 years. In 1958, Fatah released a political document, The Structure of Revolutionary Construction. This document mentioned that after 1948, Palestinians lose their homeland and live in humiliation and poverty. Therefore, Fatah carried this responsibility to liberate the occupied land through revolutionary means. Another important organization is PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization. PLO is an umbrella organization for many Palestinian factions, including Fatah, PFLP, and other political factions. In 1964, supported by Egypt. In 1968, Fatah took over PLO leadership and transferred it into a revolutionary organization. In 1968, PLO released a new charter. 3 new articles of the charter corresponding to the idea of liberation. For example, the Article 8 emphasizes the liberation of Palestine is a national struggle for the Palestinian people. And the Article 9 indicates that the armed struggle is the only way to liberate Palestine. And the armed struggle is the overall strategy, not merely a tactic. The Article 10 states that liberation requires the unity of Palestinian people and the Arab brothers in another Arab countries. From the late 1960s to the 1980s, PLO can be seen as the exiled Palestinian government. PLO has its own leader, Yasser Arafat, and the National Council, and the political, military, economic, and education institutions. It can be said that before the 1990s, PLO has ever brought a hope for many Palestinians. However, PLO revolutionary approach paid a high price. Ideally, Arab countries supported PLO liberation, but it seems like not every Arab country really want PLO to launch guerrilla war in its territory. Black September in 1970 can be seen as the first military setback for PLO. Before 1970, PLO headquarters was based in Jordan. PLO enjoyed high popularity by Palestinian refugees in Jordan. Many young Palestinians joined PLO military training. From 1968 to 1970, PLO launched thousands of guerrilla war on Israel from the Jordan territories. Some Palestinian factions even adopted aircraft hijacking in Jordan. But King Hussein of Jordan was not happy to see this scenario. Aircraft hijacking is a form of terrorism, and King Hussein was worried that the PLO popularity would threaten Jordan's national security. So the tension between PLO and Jordan was severe. In September 1970, Palestinian faction hijacked 4 airplanes and explored inside Jordanian territories. And this act of hijacking finally provoked the anger of King Hussein. King Hussein declared war on PLO. The Jordanian armed forces fought with the PLO fighters. This conflict lasted for 8 days. In the end, PLO lost 3,000 Palestinian fighters. After the mediation of the Egyptian President Nasser, PLO finally withdrew from Jordan and transferred to Lebanon as a new headquarters. Black September is the first military setback to PLO. It can be said like the Black September and the PLO revolutionary features. In 1970, PLO headquarters moved to Beirut, the capital of Lebanon. PLO also enjoyed high popularity by Palestinian refugees in Beirut. But when PLO was in Beirut, it faced many problems, such as the internal conflict within PLO and the involvement of the sectarian violence in Lebanon, and in particular, the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. In 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon. During the Israeli occupation, a Lebanese Christian militia supported by Israeli army entered 2 Palestinian refugee camps, Saba and Shatila. Only in 2 days, hundreds of Palestinian civilians were killed, and this is known as Saba and Shatila massacre. This massacre was another tragedy for many Palestinians. Palestinians commemorate Saba and Shatila massacre in every September as another collective memory of Palestine. The Israeli invasion eventually ended PLO in Lebanon. PLO could not stay in Lebanon anymore and decided to withdraw to Tunisia in North Africa, which is far away from Palestine. The Black September and the Israeli invasion of Lebanon are 2 military setbacks to PLO, while the peace process is the psychological setback, which was the major blow to the PLO. Peace process means PLO compromised the idea of liberation and ended the mutual hostility with Israel through negotiations. In November 1988, PLO issued and the Declaration of Independence. The 2 documents clearly articulate that PLO will accept UN resolutions and will establish independent Palestinian state, provided that Israel withdraw from the occupied territories, such as the East Jerusalem, West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. The 2 documents represent that PLO has changed the strategies from the armed struggle to negotiation, and the PLO also implied the legitimacy of Israel. In other words, the idea of liberation became questionable. It can be said that the idea of liberation was disregarded by PLO leadership after 1993. In this period, PLO looked for the way of coexistence with Israel through negotiation, not confrontation. In September 1993, PLO and the Israeli leader signed Declaration of Principles in Washington, D.C. And this declaration started an experiment of the two-state solution. According to this declaration, in 1993, Israel will gradually withdraw from Gaza Strip and withdraw from part of the West Bank and place it under the management of the newly established Palestinian Authority. It's called PA. In addition, Israel and the PA will negotiate on controversial issues within 5 years, such as the status of Jerusalem, the return of Palestinian refugees, the demolition of the Jewish settlements, and the security and the borders. If both sides reach a conclusion, both sides will sign a permanent agreement to end the long-term conflict. And this is the idea of the two-state solution. When the Declaration of Principle was cited, actually the majority of Israeli and the Palestinians were optimistic about their future of coexistence. However, with the passage of time, Palestinians found like their dream of establishing an independent state is unrealistic because Israel refused to withdraw from the occupied territories. If you look at the map of the West Bank, Israel still controls the most territory of the West Bank. According to the agreement cited by a leader in 1995, West Bank was divided into 3 areas: Area A, Area B, and Area C. Area A is under PA control. Area A comprises 80% of the West Bank, and PA manages political, security, education, and the social affairs. Area B constitutes 22% of the West Bank. PA only controls education, health, and the economy. If Palestinians go against Israel in Area A or Area B, Israeli military has a right to enter these 2 areas to arrest demonstrators. Area C is under Israeli control. It covers 60% of the West Bank, and the PA has no authority in Area C. Besides, Israel built Jewish settlements in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. Israel has religion and the strategic motivation to build Jewish settlements. For example, Israeli religion groups believe like the West Bank is a sacred place because in ancient times, the West Bank used to be the land of Israel. Therefore, the West Bank is not allowed to transfer to Arabs. As for Israeli politicians, they consider the Jewish settlement could be a buffer zone to secure the border of Israel. However, the Jewish settlement is illegal, violating international law. The Israeli government continues expanding number of the Jewish settlement without considering international contamination. If you look at the map, the red points are the Jewish settlements across the West Bank, and the center concentrate on the East Jerusalem. And this Jewish settlement surrounding by Palestinian cities and the villages. Today, the number of Jewish settlers are nearly 700,000. Many analysts argue like the question of the Jewish settlement will be the major obstacle to the future Palestinian state. Israel not only controls most of land in the West Bank, but also separation wall and the checkpoint restricted Palestinian freedom of movement. The reason of building separation wall is also the security concern. Israel claimed Palestinians penetrated the Jewish settlements and the Israeli territories. The separation wall also violated the international law. The wall was built from 2002. It's extending more than 700 kilometers, as you can see from this map. And most of the wall were built inside the Palestinian territories. Israel also set up roadblocks and checkpoints across the West Bank. Israeli checkpoints severely limit Palestinian freedom of movement. Palestinians take time from one place to another place in their daily commute. If Palestinians go into the checkpoint, he or she has to pass the security gate monitored by Israeli security. Let's turn to Gaza Strip. Since Hamas took over Gaza in 2007, Israel has imposed a policy of closure on Gaza. Gaza looks like the biggest prisons in the world. 2.1 million Palestinians are living in this cage. The unemployment is high, and the medical resources is not enough. Besides, from 2008, Israel has waged several wars on Gaza, killing thousands of people and destroying houses and public institutions. Finally, let's look at Jerusalem, which will be the future capital of Palestinian state. Today, Jerusalem is under the Israeli control. In 1980, Israel passed a law claiming that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. If you look at this map, Jerusalem is divided into West Jerusalem and East Jerusalem. In 1948, Israel seized West Jerusalem during the Independence War. Today, the majority of population are Jews in this area. As for East Jerusalem, it was occupied by Israel in 1967 after the Six-Day War. East Jerusalem often becomes the tipping point for Palestinians. In particular, the Aqsa Mosque compound is located in the old city of East Jerusalem, which considered the sacred place for Palestinians. But Israeli also consider this place was the relic of the Jews' holy temple in ancient times. The issue of Aqsa Mosque compound often trigger Palestinian anger toward Israel, in particular when Jewish settlers this compound. Also, Israeli politicians enter this compound for political calculation. Sometimes the Israeli military block the entrance of the Aqsa Mosque compound for security reasons. But for Palestinians, the security reason is merely another justification for Israeli control of East Jerusalem. So today, many scholars argue that Israel has imposed the apartheid policy in East Jerusalem. Palestinians could not share the same equal right with Jews regarding transportation, schools, medical facilities, and business. As a result, most of Palestinians live in poverty. In short, we can reach a preliminary conclusion. The peace process, starting from 1993, failed to bring an independent Palestinian state, even though PLO has compromised the idea of liberation. On the other hand, Israel unionized the peace process to expand the number of Jewish settlements in the West Bank and the East Jerusalem. Israel also built the separation wall, checkpoints, and imposed the closure policy on the restriction of Palestinian freedom of movement. The idea of liberation seems to be in crisis However, another Palestinian organization, Hamas, take over the law from PLO, and it claimed the armed struggle is the only way to liberate Palestine. So let me briefly introduce the rise of Hamas. Hamas was founded at the end of 1987. The founder and its senior members were refugees. Hamas' ultimate goal is to liberate Palestine through resistance, meaning the armed struggle. However, in 1990 and the early 2000s, Hamas was infamous for suicide bombing. Many Israelis were killed in buses, hotels. But Hamas rejected this term of suicide bombing. Hamas justified the action of suicide bombing because many Palestinians were also killed by Israeli soldiers and settlers. Hamas believed what it did was the martyrdom operation, the highest sacrifice in Islam. Surprisingly, Hamas won the Palestinian legislative election in January 2006, and Hamas has a right to form the new government according to the law. Many analysts believe that Hamas' strategy of resistance and its uncorrupted image helped Hamas win the election at that time. However, Hamas' victory in the election dissatisfied Fatah and the Fatah supporters. Fatah used to be the ruling party, and in early 2007, Hamas military group and the Fatah militia fought together in Gaza Strip. In June 2007, Hamas military group took over Gaza and expelled Fatah militia. Since then, Palestinian politics has split. Hamas took over Gaza and the Fatah governed the West Bank. After its takeover of Gaza, Hamas faced a dilemma. Gaza was under the Israeli closure. The closure of Gaza leads to the rise of unemployment rate and the lack of resources. Also, other Palestinian militia revenge against Hamas. Many analysts at that time believe that Hamas governance on Gaza will be breakdown soon. However, Hamas restored law and order in Gaza and tried to build Gaza as a resistant society. When Israel increased the closure of Gaza and killed Palestinians, Hamas launches rockets into the Israeli territories. In response, Israeli retaliate massive airstrike and send ground forces to the Gaza Strip, causing the thousands of Palestinian deaths, destruction of infrastructure and the private buildings. Hamas rocket is usually seen as an act of terrorism, but it should be noted that Hamas rocket is also seen a form of resistance by the majority of Palestinians, and Hamas popularity reached a peak during the Israeli heavy bombardment of Gaza. It seems like the resistance became the consensus across East Jerusalem and the West Bank. But the resistance approach has limitations. Firstly, Hamas failed to lift the closure of Gaza imposed by Israel. When Hamas controlled Gaza, it claimed that Gaza would be an example of resistance model. And Hamas was confident that the resistance approach will transfer to East Jerusalem and the West Bank. However, over the past decade, Hamas' resistance approach is not able to lift the closure of Gaza. Rather, the closure of Gaza leads to the problem of unemployment and the military confrontation between Hamas and Israel. In addition, not every Palestinian agreed with Hamas' resistance approach. The long-term closure of Gaza made many Palestinians lose patience with Hamas. In particular, some young Palestinians consider Hamas as an oppressive regime. I even heard some young Palestinians left Gaza and sought political asylum to the Western countries because they dislike Hamas governance. Finally, Hamas' resistant approach is now welcomed by some Arab countries. In particular, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt consider Hamas as a troublemaker in this region, and Hamas become an obstacle to the reconciliation between Arab countries and Israel. In summary, Hamas inherits the idea of liberation from PLO, but Hamas faced a similar scenario. The armed struggle could not really help Palestinians to liberate their homeland. Instead, under the Israeli bombardment, the casualty of Palestinians was so high in Gaza. Furthermore, Palestinians in East Jerusalem and the West Bank still suffer from the Israeli occupation. So the question is, the idea of liberation come to an end? In recent 15 years, an alternative to the idea of liberation was emerged. In 2005, Palestinian civil society started the BDS movement, calling for the international community to pressure Israel to end the occupation. BDS is the acronym of boycott, divestment, and section, considered like Israeli denial of Palestinian fundamental rights. The end of the BDS movement was to end the Israeli occupation, dismantle Israeli separation wall, and the Jewish settlements. Support Palestinian citizens of Israel to obtain full equality with Jewish citizens, and Palestinian refugees must have the right of return to their homeland. In recent years, the BDS movement seems to develop well across the globe and has attracted media attention. An increasing number of trade unions and student unions across North America, South America, Europe, and South Africa support the BDS movement. But it should be noted that the BDS movement mainly adopts a non-violent approach and do not endorse the armed struggle taken by Palestinians. The BDS movement also comes with the idea of one-state solution. The idea of one-state solution is like Palestinians and the Jews cooperate to build a binational state. But the binational state needs a precondition, which is the process of decolonization. The decolonization indicates the removal of Zionism, which is the ideology of the state of Israel. In other words, Israel must admit its historical mistake to Palestinians over the 70 years. After that, 4 critical issues: the Jewish illegal settlement, the right of return for Palestinian refugees, the status of Palestinians within Israel, and the East Jerusalem should be resolved. Today, the BDS is an international campaign. Palestinians work together with foreign activists in order to end the Israeli occupation. But BDS has also limitations. The Western government, such as the US, UK, France, and Canada, under the influence of the Israeli lobby, do not support this movement. And this government attempts to criminalize it as an anti-Semitism, which is the racism against Jews. Furthermore, the BDS movement has a geographical limitation. Palestinians work closely with activists in the Western countries, but not many intellectuals and students in East Asia involve this movement. Perhaps people living in East Asia do not understand the complex history between Zionists and the Palestinians. Furthermore, Israel has a good reputation across East Asia, as Israel is famous for its high-tech achievement and a tourist attraction. But the BDS movement has become the new methods for many Palestinians use social media and attend international events to seek solidarity with other people who really care about Palestine. In conclusion, liberation for Palestinians is not only an action, but an idea. And this idea was triggered by the creation of Israel in 1948. Because of Israel, Palestinians are deprived of building their independent state. Secondly, the Palestinian national movement attempted to adopt the armed struggle for the realization of liberation, but it often paid a high price. Many Palestinians were killed and still suffer from the Israeli occupation. But it seems like some Palestinian organizations or individuals still insist on this approach, even today. Finally, in recent years, Palestinian activists engaged with the BDS movement. This movement brings the question of Palestine to the international stage. Today, the image of Palestinians is not terrorist, as the media portrayed in the 1970s. Instead, Palestinian liberation symbolized the value of dignity, justice, and freedom. Even so, the balance of power is still on the Israeli side. The idea of liberation is still supported by many Palestinians. That is the end of my lecture. Thank you for listening. If you have any question or comment, I'm happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bob. You really, your talk really addresses some of our wondering and curiosity and maybe misunderstanding for some audience. Now the floor is open. If anyone from the audience has any question, you can leave your question and remark in this Q&A section, or you can raise your hand. Before we get any question or comments from the floor, let me bring up some reflection or thoughts, okay? Because in the two films that we watched, one is this Tears of Gaza, that apparently is about this 2007 strike, right, from Israel. It's heavy bombing. That actually bombing recur again and again, even just previously a few months ago, right? So we saw all these children. The director, I think it's Norwegian director, purposely focus on the children's perspective. So that's very moving and touching. The other film, I think it's a very good film, Ghost Hunting, by this director, Ray Adoni, about his being kept, and many Palestinian people being kept in the detention center, the Moscow Bia detention center. We also know that Palestinian in Gaza or is Jerusalem, they actually do not obtain any equal citizenship. Their entry or exit is very strictly forbidden. So as you said, really act of decolonization actually should be the first step, right? Because the whole world is watching this Israeli government being so brutally, so savagely actually occupying this land and also or debasing, colonizing these people, right? My maybe question is that I know the idea of this one state solution also is brought up by your former teacher, Ilan Pape, right? He's an Israeli scholar, historian. Is this idea initiated by Israeli intellectuals or from Palestinian intellectuals too? And how much collaboration between Israeli and Palestinian people at this point? Actually, 20, 30 years ago, when I was still in the States, I watched quite a few documentaries of collaboration of activists between Israeli and Palestinian people. But in recent 2 decades, I think it became more and more difficult, according to my understanding. Could you say a little bit more about these collaborations in bridging up or reducing the wartime situation? Yeah, nowadays. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for Professor Liu's comment and questions. From my understanding, the idea of one-state solution is only idea, but it's also the action. And I think the Edward Said, the late Professor Edward Said, maybe he's the first person to systemize the idea of one-state solution in the early 1990s during the peace process. Because Edward Said has already known the peace process could not really solve the fundamental problem between the Israeli and the Palestinian conflict. And during that time, there's another international movement on South Africa to end the apartheid system of South Africa. So Edward Said considered South Africa maybe become another lesson or example for the future between Palestinian and the Israeli. And during this around 20 years, some of the Israeli intellectuals, such as Ilan Pape and other Palestinian intellectuals, they work together and they formed an organization or discussion for promote the idea of the one-state solution. But from my understanding, inside Israel, the person who really, the Jews who really support the one-state solution, this idea is the minority. Like the Ilan Pape or other brave Israelis, intellectual or historians, they were considered as the non-Zionist because their ideology violate the principle of the creation of Israel. And these Jews intellectual usually in Israel will face the huge criticism or even the threat from the Zionist right-wing organization. But as for the Palestinian, the one-state solution is an idea or also is a social movement. But from my understanding, the majority of Palestinians, this Palestinians do not really care about the one-state or two-state solution because this is not touched with their daily experience under the Israeli occupation. And so far, they just want to immediately end the Israeli occupation. Yeah, that's my understanding.
Is it possible?
In short time, I think even many people consider it is an impossible task. I can see in Western country, in the grassroots movement, and many young Palestinian and young Jews, try to work together because they think the two-state solution decided by the US is not workable solution. So the one-state solution is the only way, like they look forward.
Yes, yes. One other just thoughts you mentioned is East Asian countries. Yeah. They really support Israeli state as following the U.S. policy. Taiwan is a typical case. You want to say more about it?
Okay. I think I still thinking about this because Israel in the past in Taiwan has good reputation. Many Taiwanese politicians and businessmen often portray Israel as a role model because they have an image like after the creation of Israel, Israel was surrounded by the hostile Arab country. And Taiwan, it seems like Taiwan also faced a similar scenario. But I think this is not a really historical fact. I just treat it as the narrative. But if we can consider another angle, Palestinians can be also become the model for the Taiwanese people because the Palestinians over the 17 years, they were under the Israeli occupation. Until now, they still surrender to Israel. But I can see now the thing has been changed as Taiwan integrating into the global society. I can see many young Taiwanese students and people, they travel to Israel and travel to the occupied territory. And also some of them go abroad in the Western country. So they can receive the first-hand experience knowledge. So I can see in the future, maybe in the future, the situation of understanding Palestine and Israel will be changing.
Yeah, actually there is an alliance, a huge network among students, I noticed, to support Palestinian liberation, right? How about other countries in Northeast Asia or Southeast Asia, according to your understanding?
I think in Indonesia and Malaysia, because also these countries are Muslim majority, and some Palestinians are living in these two countries. So there's a connection in terms of the religion.
Okay, more understanding, yeah. Yeah, I think there is a hand. Yeah, Professor Farid, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Joyce. And thank you, Dr. Bao, for your presentation. It was really very, very comprehensive. I think it helps a lot of us to understand the problem. So I just have a couple of comments. I guess there's also a question there. I think one of the problems is that the Palestinians, in particular, but also the Arabs as a whole, never really succeeded to promote their cause in a way that they could really capture the sympathy of the world. And part of that, I think, has to do with the role of terrorism. This idea of defending suicide bombing as martyrdom it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. It doesn't work with non-Muslims, and it doesn't work with many Muslims as well. It's actually really, to me, it's a kind of evil as well. And simply, to actually try to justify it in Islamic terms is horrendous. It's terrible, and I think that has resulted in some withdrawal of sympathy ever since they started killing civilians. I'm not, that naive into thinking that it's just a matter of public relations. A lot of the sympathy and the support or lack of it has also to do with the strength of the Israeli lobby in the US, with the role of the US in its imbalanced role in the Middle East. But I think still, I think we have to note that the Arabs did not do a good job, whether it's in terms of alternative media, or whether it's in terms of influencing Hollywood to make more movies, films, that are pro Palestine, or at least present a more balanced picture, and so on and so forth. And one of the issues, and this is what I want to ask you, I think the international propaganda against Israel would have been stronger if the idea of colonialism was promoted. Because I think it is not just a situation of oppression, which it is, of course, but it's not merely that. The context is really colonialism. It's one of the last few colonies left on the earth. And it's an apartheid type of colonialism. And it's a double colonialism. See, we only speak about the West Bank and Gaza. We speak about occupation, right? But the whole of Palestine is colonized. So you have a settler kind of colonialism, which refers to the colonization of what is today called Israel. And then that settler colonial state is occupying the occupied territories. So it's a kind of double colonialism. And of course, many activists and scholars have started to refer to the kind of colonialism as a form of apartheid, right? And I think the Arabs haven't done a good job in promoting that idea to gain sympathy from around the world. And the other unfortunate thing is turning it into an Islamic issue, and it is not. As you yourself noted, there are Palestinian Christians, and it's not a religious issue. It is an issue of colonialism, and I think it should be understood that way. And if they are to gain, it should be seen in terms of liberation from a kind of colonialism. Are we speaking about liberation just from for the people in the occupied territories, or a broader notion of liberation? And do the methods like BDS, do they address liberation in the broader sense, or just in the narrower sense of the term? Narrower meaning liberation for people living in the occupied territories. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the idea of liberation is a very complex idea. But from the historical perspective, before 1990, the PLO and the Fatah dominate the idea of liberation, and their aim is to liberate all Palestine, as I said in the beginning, from the Mediterranean Sea to Jordan River. And they also give the future political solution about the Jews. They say the Jews, if they remove the idea of Zionists, they can still stay in the land of Palestine and coexist with other Palestinian people. But this because I choose the topic, because this is my feeling, not many scholars seriously talk about the idea of liberation. They, at the moment, like the BDS movement, talk about the occupation, immediate occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the lifting the closure of Gaza. And also, like Professor, you say, inside Israel, there is another 20% of Palestinians living inside Israel. And many of them still be treated as a secondary citizen inside Israel. So from my understanding, the Palestinian intellectual or like the Fatah before the 1990 and like Hamas today. The idea of liberation include the historical Palestine. And as you professor said, like the Fatah or Hamas, they adopted the armed struggle, killing the innocent, the Jewish population. Yes, they try to justify the action, and they try to justify the action with the Islamic principle. So I can see now today there's some debate about the methods of liberation. Some Palestinians still believe the armed struggle is effective, and some Palestinians, or in particular the foreign activists, even they condemn the armed struggle. They still believe that non-violence will be the ultimate goal.
There's one question. I don't know whether Farid wants to follow up, but there's one question in this Q&A section from a student our student from Indonesia.
Okay.
What do you think about the disappearance of Palestine on world map? It resulted in the world trending, said that Palestinian is here. Does this help for the idea of liberation? Another thing is actually Google claimed that Palestine was never on the map. Is it true? But yeah, you want to address that?
Yeah. Today I think there are across the globe many people really support Palestine. Like in particular in the Western country, and the young university students, they are enthusiastic and sympathy of Palestine. Like the audience said, Palestine is now considered as a country by the Google, yeah. And the Google didn't mention the name of Palestine on the Google map. Also mentioned the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. But I try to understand the reason, but from my understanding, the Google didn't respond why the Google didn't mention Palestine on the map.
Really? It doesn't exist? I'm checking it up. Yeah, Wikipedia, no, Wikipedia, yeah, it's all Israel. Well, any other question or comments? Dr. Bao, does other Arab countries support this one-state solution? I think, what do you think? I mean, from your talk, you said there are Israeli and also Palestinian intellectuals or activists trying to promote this one-state solution through non-violence, right? That is actually a negotiation or a recognition of this bi-nation state coexistence. Of course, the premises should be on equal terms, right? Should not be oppressed regime of the oppressor and the oppressed or colonized. So decolonization or epistemic decolonization should be the first step. Other Arab countries, Saudi Arabia or other countries that objected to their previous violent act. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like in Arab country, in the society level, Palestine is still the major cause for many Arab people, because Palestine is also the Arabs, and the Palestinian issue become the center, in particular during the 1960 to 1970. But while things has been changed, now in Arab countries, some Arab countries, like I said earlier, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, they didn't, maybe they have their political calculation. So they are, now they are close to Israel, and they ignore the Palestinian right. And many Palestinians, from my understanding, they didn't like this Arab regime, but they really want supported by the Arab masses across the region. Yeah.
Yeah. Another question from this Q&A section, perhaps both Dr. Bao and Professor Farid could address, that is, why do we really need to emphasize this concept or the phenomenon of colonialism of our time? The question is, I also agree that this is not just a conflict about colonialism, but could Dr. Bao and Dr. Farid elaborate more on the significance of circulating the narrative of colonialism, or whether how does that make it a stronger rhetoric, or maybe not a rhetoric, but a reality? We need to acknowledge that there is this internal colonialism everywhere. So that is to push further on this essence or nature of coloniality, right? But I think Professor Farid and Dr. Bao, you have more to say, right? Yeah.
Okay. Yes, nowadays, from the Western academics, the people who really do the research about Palestine, they change the paradigm, like the colonization, to see the relation between Israel and Palestine. And this is mostly by the historian and the sociology or anthropologists. But from the political science, this idea to treat state, I think is not accepted by the many political scientists. And if so, I think there's still a debate in the academic in terms of the various disciplines. Yeah.
Professor Farid, do you want to add?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think it's a good question. The question from Nina, which, you know, she said, what makes colonialism a stronger rhetoric? Yeah, and of course, you know, as Joyce said, it's a reality, but to promote an understanding of that reality, we need the rhetorical effect. That's the nature of language, right? We need the rhetorical effect. And I think colonialism has that rhetorical effect. And my reasoning is that, you know, oppression goes on everywhere, but and people, you know, are aware of oppression to various degrees all over the world. But people seem to have a greater aversion for colonialism, for oppression that happens in the context of colonialism. Because the oppression that is taking place in the context of colonialism is oppression of a people who have no control of their destiny, who don't have the right, who don't have, you know, the right of rule. So I think this makes a difference. Okay. And the idea of colonialism must be linked to apartheid. You know, there is that discussion that's been going on for many years, talking about the apartheid-like nature of Israel, but that needs to be made more global, and it also has to be connected to the idea of the Jews having suffered in history. The most, you know, recent being the Holocaust, in which millions were murdered, and for a people who have undergone such suffering, who have been displaced from their places of citizenship in Europe during the war, for example. For such a people who have undergone such hardship, they are doing they are inflicting hardship on Palestinians. So I think this kind of discussion, but in the context of this double colonialism that I was talking about, is how the you know, we may gain, or the world may become more sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, and it's part of using such terms. But of course, as Joyce said, it's not mere rhetoric. We are trying to explain. You know, we want to convey an understanding, a different understanding of that reality, which we think is a more correct understanding of that reality.
Sure. Apartheid, divide and rule, or this oppressor, oppressed, and this all those will help us to understand more of the current situation of Palestinian people, and so on. That should be brought in to people's understanding. I was told that our time is up. I would encourage everyone to keep connected with Dr. Bao. I think our team, our staff will include every speaker's email on the our booklet so that people can write to them, okay, and to keep this conversation going on. And so I guess we need to pause here. See you later at 4 o'clock. All right. Dr. Bao, thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Liu. Thank you.
Yeah. Bye-bye. Yeah. See you later. Yes.